looking at the book of Samuel. I'll warn you now, we have 8 weeks. We're not going to get anywhere near the end. Samuel's one of the longest books in the Bible, and in your English Bibles, it's split into two. But originally was one book. Okay, and in fact, if you just start reading, at 1 Samuel 1, read all the way through to the end, chapter 31, and just ignore the big 2 Samuel at the top of the page and kept on reading into 2 Samuel 1 and so forth, you'll see it's all one continuous book. Probably split into two in antiquity already, but one continuous book. So we're not going to do even the 31 chapters in 1 Samuel, I don't think we'll get to in the 6 or 8 weeks we have to do it. But we'll get started, and maybe next year we'll take another chunk of it. So there's quite a lot to do. But today we want to start on some introductory stuff first of all. So let me get my slideshow up here. If it'll work. Okay, there we go. So that's where we are. So keep in mind, we're talking 2 books in your English Bible, 1 book in Hebrew. One of the most extensive books in the Old Testament, maybe not exactly the longest, but one of the longer books of the Old Testament. And it's basically about how the kingship came to be in Israel in the first 2 real kings. Okay, so the first part of the book, we meet the man the book is named after, Samuel. Samuel's the last of the judges. We might even call him the second great prophet of Israel after Moses. And it's under Samuel that God establishes the kingship, first with Saul. And as we come to the end of 1 Samuel, we come to the end of Saul's reign over Israel. And then 2 Samuel basically covers David's reign over Israel. So that's probably why the book was split at that point, because you get the death of Saul, chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, and then you get the reign of David throughout 2 Samuel. Okay. So there's a lot of material to cover here, and like I said, we won't get through all of them, but we'll try. But I want to start with some kind of basic information about the book. So when was this book composed? Well, we have a couple of clues if we pay attention to what the author tells us. So, for instance, in 2 Samuel 2 or 5, we're told David lived in the stronghold. This is in Jerusalem. And he named it the City of David. He built all around from the Millo toward the house, meaning the palace probably. Well, we know the Millo was built by Solomon. So whoever's writing this is giving place directions from a later time. There was no Millo in David's day. Solomon actually built that structure. So whoever's writing this has to be writing at a later date, looking back, to use this geographical destination of this place called the Millo in Jerusalem. So it's sometime after the reign of David that this book is being written. Okay. Whoops, wrong way. Then there is an interesting thing where on several occasions the writer talks about certain things that the reader can see or know about to this day, the day that he's writing the book, the time that he's writing the book. For instance, he talks about the priests of Dagon among the Philistines do not step on the threshold of his temple, and the rock on which the ark was placed in the field of Joshua Beth Shemesh, and it's still there to this day. You can go see it, the author says. Or Ziklag belongs to the kings of Judah, notice kings, plural, of Judah, to this day, he says, and so forth. Well, when we look at those, what's the earliest date we can assign to that? Well, some of these could be as early as the reign of Saul, but some have to be much later. Ziklag belongs to the kings of Judah. Well, David was king of all Israel. Solomon was king of all Israel. There's not a kingdom of Judah until after Solomon's death, when the kingdom splits into Israel and Judah. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. So the fact that he notes that David got the city of Ziklag as a royal possession and it belongs to the kings of Judah to this day, kings plural, means there must have been several kings of Judah before that could be written. So this is probably written no earlier than the reign of Abijah, who reigned from 915 to 912 BC. Okay, so we're talking at least 100 years after David's death that the writer sits down to write, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, this history of Israel and the early years of the kingship. And so we need to keep in mind that this is not being written down as it's happening, but it's a history that's written down sometime later. Probably had access to sources that told him what happened, just like all good historians do. Okay. So there are a number of these statements like this, and they tell us something about when the book could be written. The other interesting thing about the book of Samuel is that it has parallels in other parts of the Old Testament. Now, the book of Chronicles was written later than the book of Samuel. Samuel, as I said, probably no earlier than the late 10th century, 900 BC, something like that. Let's say it's written 900 BC. The book of Chronicles is written after the Babylonian captivity, so you're talking 6th century BC. So it's maybe 300 years later. But it looks like the chronicler used material in the book of Samuel. And these are all passages that are parallel. Sometimes word for word, although sometimes the chronicler adds his own information and his own twist on the material as he uses it. But you'll find a number of the events, beginning with Saul's death in battle at the end of 1 Chronicles and working through David's reign, that are parallel. And I've listed them for you, and you can actually compare the two accounts. Like I said, sometimes it'll be almost word for word the same. But the chronicler sometimes is paraphrasing or doing other things too. So keep in mind that some of these events are related more than one time in the Old Testament itself. Okay? But mostly they're from the reign of David. Nothing from the reign of Saul is in the book of Chronicles other than his death. They're quite extensive. Here's some more. You'll notice it goes all the way to 2 Samuel 24. 2 Samuel 24 is the last chapter in 2 Samuel. And so there's a lot of these parallels. Now, one of the interesting things is the chronicler does not give us a lot about David's great sin, his sin with Bathsheba. He skips over that when he writes his history. History writers are always selective. Nobody writes a history and tells you everything that happened. They always are doing kind of a selective account of what happened, considering what they think is important. So, you know, if you read a biography of one of the presidents of the United States, he's probably not going to tell you how many times a day that president brushed his teeth. He just doesn't think it's important. He might know, but he's not going to tell you unless he thinks it's important for some reason, right? So all history writers are selective. They select the things that they think are important for telling the story of past events. Well, the same thing happens with the chronicler. When he writes Chronicles, he doesn't, his interest is not in the account with Bathsheba and the rebellion of Absalom and a number of things that we have in the Book of Kings. But there are other things we do have in the Book of Kings that he is interested in using. And sometimes he uses the book of Samuel as, the book of Samuel, sometimes chronicler uses the book of Samuel as a source, as he's writing his history. So I've given you a list of places. The other thing that's interesting is in 2 Samuel 22, we have the account of a psalm written by David, and it's identical to Psalm 18. Okay, so 2 Samuel 22, near the end of the book, we're told David wrote this psalm when God delivered him from his enemies, and then that same psalm appears again, Psalm 18. So that's another parallel.
Where do Kings fit in this?
Kings picks up with the very, very last years of David. David's death is not related in Samuel. Okay? So if you want to know about David's death and Saul becoming king, that's Solomon becoming king, excuse me. That is 1 Kings 1 and 2. So in 1 Kings 2, we learn of David's death. Solomon had already been made king during David's lifetime. So basically, the rest of the Kings is related in the book of Kings. And again, a lot of that material in Kings is used in the Chronicles. So we have more parallels between Kings and Chronicles as well as between Samuel.
Are those known as 3rd and 4th Samuel at one time?
No. But the books we have in the Old Testament that are 1st and 2nd were all split. Okay, so Samuel was originally one book, Kings was originally one book, Chronicles was originally one book. Okay, but they were split probably in ancient times when this was all translated into Greek for Jews who were speaking Greek and not living in the Holy Land, but living like in Egypt, where Greek was more common. And so when the books were translated into Greek, one of the interesting things that happens is it usually takes more words in Greek to say the same thing as it does in Hebrew. So all of a sudden the books get longer, and when you're working with scrolls, there's a limit to how big of a scroll you want to put things on, right? So that's probably why they split these books into two already before the time of Jesus. Okay. So you have 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, it's interesting, when it was put into Greek, they did number Samuel and Kings consecutively. So in the Greek version, 1st and 2nd Samuel were 1st and 2nd Kingdoms. And 1st and 2nd Kings were 3rd and 4th Kingdoms. That's how they labeled it. But at any rate, you should keep in mind that some of these things that, especially when we get to 2 Samuel, 3 years from now, those things are written elsewhere in the Old Testament. Oops, I went the wrong way. Got to learn which way to swipe. Here's kind of a basic timeline of the events we're talking about. So when we open up the book, we find a man named Eli as high priest, and he lived to be quite old. He was high priest for quite a few years. We learn about the Ark of the Covenant going out and being captured by the Philistines. When it goes out, when the Israelites take the battle, it's returned. About 1068 BC, it was May or June actually, in 1068. We learn about Samuel becoming judge and prophet, probably for a period of about 11 years or so. Samuel eventually is told to anoint Saul to reign as king. So Saul's reign is in here. David's born during Saul's reign. Samuel anoints David to replace Saul near the end of Saul's reign. Samuel dies before Saul does. So that's kind of a basic timeline of 1 Samuel. Okay, so you can kind of see how the events relate. Okay, I've also included on this handout a whole list of dates for you that you can consult if you kind of want to say, well, when was this happening in history? These are all dates BC, before Christ. And so this is kind of the basic chronology. The reign of Saul begins about 1049. David begins reigning in the Hebrew month of Nisan, that is the first month of spring, in 1009. At first he only reigns in Hebron. Later on, about 1002 in the fall, that's what that T means, the Hebrew month of Tishri, first month of fall, he begins reigning in Jerusalem, and he reigns to 969. Solomon becomes king. He reigns, has a co-regency, he reigns with David, probably about 2 years before David died, so 971 to 969. And then Solomon, whose reign is not related in the book of Kings, but just to show you how it continues on, he reigns by himself from 969 to 932 BC. Okay, so that's kind of how these first kings of Israel work out. Saul to David to Solomon. I also have more dates as we go along. You might want to keep this sheet in case you want to know what happened when. This is a lot of the dates of things that happen, and I give you the chapters in 1 Samuel here. So as we work through some of these chapters, hopefully when we get to them, you can see what happens when. Okay, and that's the only reason for that, is you can, if you want to know kind of where are we in history, where are we in time when we're looking at these. I've tried to list it all out for you. It goes on. This is David's reign in 2 Samuel. So if you want to know some of these events as we march through 2 Samuel someday, perhaps in the future, that's what that looks like. This is David's reign in Jerusalem and some of the events from that. And again, I give you the chapters and verses where those events are talked about. So this is all just there for you. You know, if you kind of want to know, you don't have to keep it all in your head this way. You can just kind of look and say, oh, okay, that's where we are in time when we're reading this chapter or that chapter of the book of Samuel. That's the only reason I included those for you. There's more. David's reign has a lot of events to it because of the whole book of 2 Samuel. So there's another slide with that. I take it up to David's death, which again is in 1 Kings 2. So it overlaps, you know, it goes from 2 Samuel into 1 Kings. So all those dates there are just for you there, and whether you're doing your private reading at home of the book of Samuel or whether we're working through it in class at some time, and you kind of want to say, okay, now I want to get it straight in my head. What happens when? Well, this is just for you to help you do that. Okay? Question?
Just really quickly, I mean, and I know this is kind of off track a little bit, but can you kind of give us the 2-minute quick version of who are the other big world powers at this time?
Yeah. This is an interesting period of time in that for most of the history up until the coming of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, this area is dominated by powers to the south, Egypt, and powers to the, we'd call it east, I guess, or northeast, Assyria and Babylon. But during this particular period of time, the powers to the east and the power to the south, Egypt, are on decline. And there's kind of a power vacuum in the land of Israel, what we now know as Syria, Lebanon, and you have the rise of kind of mini empires. Okay, and eventually David will create one of these kind of mini empires in this part of the world. So Egypt, yeah, is still influential, but not like it was in its heyday. Okay, Assyria is yet to rise on the scene. Eventually, the Assyrians will, be a major power, but not yet. Okay, and the Babylonians after them. There was an old Babylonian empire at one time during Abraham's day that was very powerful, but it's waned. It's gone away. So the rise of the kingdom of Israel and David's great success happened in this kind of power vacuum in this part of the world. Okay, so Egypt's still important to the south. Okay, no major powers to speak of to the east or north at this particular time. And so we read of David battling other kingdoms and conquering them. So he ends up conquering the Syrians and the Damascus, the Arameans, and the Ammonites and the Moabites. Okay, and he makes friends with Hiram, king of Tyre, which is one of the Phoenician cities up on the coast in Lebanon. Okay, and so the Tyrians are kind of a major power at this point, but in a much more minor sense than the big empires that often had dominated this part of the world.
Early part of Saul's reign and Samuel's time, was that also the time of Troy?
Probably,
About 1,000.
yeah, probably Saul's a little before that. More like the last part of David's reign, early part of Solomon's reign. The major threat to Israel when we open up the book of Samuel are the Philistines. They're living on the coast of what we would now think of the Mediterranean coast of the southern part of Israel. Okay, they are a major threat to Israel, and they have been for some time, all the way back to Samson, who was judge. Samson battles the Philistines, okay, but he doesn't really deal with them successfully. Samuel helps Israel by praying to the Lord, and Israel gets a victory over the Philistines. And the Philistines are finally taken out of the equation altogether by David. So the Philistines are kind of a major local power, not in a larger world sense, but a kind of a major local power in Israel's neighborhood. The other kind of power that we read about are the Ammonites, and they also attack, and Saul does battle with them, and David eventually conquers the Ammonites. We learn about David sending Joab, his nephew, commander of his army, out to the city of Rabbah to conquer it. That happens about the time David's committing adultery with Bathsheba. Okay, the city of Rabbah is the modern-day city of Amman, Jordan. Amman is named after the Ammonites. Okay, so you can actually, well, I wouldn't recommend it now, but you could go to Amman, Jordan. It's kind of dicey over there right now, but you could go to Amman, Jordan, and actually see the ruins of ancient Rabbah. They've preserved it. Those are kind of the local players. The Tyrian Phoenicians up north, Hiram, king of Tyre, Ammonites, Philistines, as well as the Israelites, kind of clustered in between all those powers. And David conquers most of these people and creates an empire.
The Philistines, are they current day Palestinians?
No, they're not. Most of these people kind of lose their ethnic identity. So the Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, Philistines, they all kind of blend in together after a while. And by New Testament times, they've mostly lost their ethnic identity. So yeah, some of the present-day Palestinians might have come from, say, the Philistines, but they've lost their kind of ethnic identification at that point.
Moabites and Ammonites and Israelites, they were all related.
Yeah, they're all related. Moab,
Ammonites.
yeah. Moab and Edom, the Edomites. Edom comes from Esau. Okay. Ammon is related. They're kind of distant cousins. They're all kind of distant cousins of the Israelites. Philistines, not so. The Philistines apparently are more related to the Greeks, apparently, as far as we know. But the Ammonites, the Moabites, and so forth, they are kind of distant relatedly, distant cousins of Israel. Any other questions? Okay, well, that's the just quick introduction. I'm going to pass out another sheet, and we're going to start looking at the book of Samuel. This covers the first 3 chapters, so we'll when we open up the book of Samuel, the first person we meet is a guy named Elkanah. Okay, and from what we learn about Elkanah, both and when he's introduced here, and also from information about him and his family that we find in the book of Chronicles, we learn that Elkanah is a Levite. He's from the tribe of Levi. Okay, now you'll remember Levi is a fairly important tribe. Anybody know what other great Israelite was from the tribe of Levi?
Moses?
Aaron, and therefore also Moses, right? Aaron and Moses were from the tribe of Levi. Now all the priests of Israel were from the tribe of Levi, but not all Levites were priests. Only those Levites who were descended from Aaron. Okay? Well, Samuel is not descended from Aaron. He's not a priest. Although oftentimes he's called that, but he is not a priest. He serves in the temple as a Levite. And Levites served in the temple, or before there was a temple built by Solomon, in the tabernacle, as assistants to the priests. So the Levites who were not priests would still serve, but not as priests. They didn't offer the sacrifices. They did other jobs in the tabernacle. And when we meet Samuel, we find out eventually he ends up serving in the tabernacle under the high priest, Eli. Now, Eli is a direct descendant of Aaron. Okay? So, just because you're a Levite does not make you a priest. You have to be both a Levite and from a particular line of Levites. That is the line that began with Aaron. Okay? And, you know, even some Bible scholars confuse this and call Samuel a priest. He was not a priest. The Bible never calls him a priest. But it does trace his lineage back to Levi, one of the sons of Jacob. Okay, and so he's from the tribe of Levi. Now, the interesting thing about the tribe of Levi is they're the one tribe that got no kind of contiguous chunk of land in Israel. They got cities that were scattered throughout all of the other tribes. Okay, so you'll have these Levitical cities within the tribe of Judah, within the tribe of Manasseh, within the tribe of Ephraim, and so forth. Okay, and we find out at the very beginning of the book that Elkanah, Samuel's father, is from one of these places. So let's turn to 1 Samuel 1 in our Bibles. And could I have someone read the first 3 verses?
certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zup, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives, one was called Hannah, and the other
Penina.
Penina had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord.
Okay, so we learned that this guy is from a certain city and that he's a Zuphite. He's from Ramathaim, Zophim, Ramathaim of the Zuphites. Okay, the Zuphites were descended from a guy named Kohath through a guy named Izhar, who was a brother of Amram, and Amram was the father of Aaron and Moses. So they're kind of distant cousins of these guys, Hophni and Phinehas, who we're told were serving there. Eli's an old man by this point. He's the high priest, but he's an old man. He's not as active as he once was, so his 2 sons are doing the major service there, Hophni and Phinehas.
Pretty fat too, wasn't
Yeah, he was. We'll find out later he was a very heavy-set man. Okay, but we can reconstruct this clan of Levites using information in Exodus and 1 Chronicles. Now it's interesting in these 3 verses. Hannah was the first wife. It's very clear. Hannah was the first wife he married, and then he marries Penina. But when they start mentioning children, you know, he had 2 wives, Hannah, Penina, and then he said, then it says Penina had children, Hannah had none. The order is reversed. In the ancient world, you know, status in the family for a wife was determined by whether you could produce children. Okay, so even though she's the second wife, when it, you know, she now has the upper hand, and the author's pretty subtle about this, you know, in that he introduces Hannah before Penina, but then when he starts talking about children, he switches it around. Okay, so this is very important. Now, notice we talk about Elkanah's sons. He has sons. And then immediately we start talking about Eli's sons. This guy was Elkanah was very pious Israelite, and he would go up every year to where the tabernacle was. In this case, it's located at a place called Shiloh. It moved around. It was a tent, so it could move around. At this point in history, it was at Shiloh. And he would go every year to worship God, we're told there. And then we learn about Eli's sons. Now this is important because in the early chapters, there's going to be a contrast between Elkanah's son and Eli's sons. Okay? And we're going to contrast them over and over again. So it's not an accident that he says he went up to Shiloh, and then he kind of does this little diversion. By the way, there's these 2 priests there in Shiloh, Hophni and Phinehas. Okay? So that's why he does that. So Eli and his sons are there for this contrast to the pious Elkanah. Okay, so Elkanah, very pious man, goes up, offers sacrifices, worships God at the tabernacle in Shiloh. Very faithful Levite. And the priests are Eli and his 2 sons. The priest, by the way, the high priest serves all the time. He's always kind of on duty, okay, at the tabernacle. The other priests are divided into 12, I don't know what you call them, cohorts. And, no, 24, I'm sorry, 24 cohorts. And each one of those cohorts would come and serve for a month and then go back to wherever they lived. So every 2 years, if you were a priest other than the high priest, you'd be on duty. Okay, you'd be on duty for a whole month, then you'd go back to your home and you'd farm and whatever you did for a living. Okay, the fact that Hophni and Phinehas are said to be here serving as priests tells us that Eli and we're going to learn this later on, Eli's an old man. He couldn't do all the duties of the high priest, apparently, and so he has his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, kind of on continual duty. Normally, they'd be only on duty like every other priest that's not a high priest, only 1 month out of every 2 years. Okay, so they're kind of filling in for Dad, who they didn't have retirement funds and 401k, so Dad just continued to be high priest. We find out Eli's, what, 90 years old or something like that when he died. So he lives, especially for that day and age, pretty old age. Okay, so all this happens about 1090 BC. Okay, we're in the 11th century BC, early in it actually. Well, let's go the other way. Let's look at verses 4 through 8. Could somebody read that?
Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and wives. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?
Okay. So, trouble in the family with the two wives, right? Now, Elkanah apparently recognizes the societal norms, right? Peninnah, is the more favored wife because she has children, and he's trying to counteract that with his first wife Hannah. He loved his first wife Hannah, so he gives her this extra portion, right? And he's in essence trying to counteract that a little bit. But Peninnah, of course, wants to keep the upper hand as the second wife, who's now kind of first societal wise, right? And so she provokes Hannah and makes her sad. We have this tension in the family because of the two wives. Elkanah's question is interesting. He loves his wife, but he doesn't quite get it. His first questions depict him as either unaware or unmindful of the tensions between his two wives. Why are you so gloomy, right? And then his final question displays how he's unable to sympathize with Hannah. Aren't I better to you than 7 sons? Easy for him to say he's got sons. Right? He's got sons. She doesn't. Now, the scriptures never come out and say, in so many words, God didn't mean for men to have more than one wife. However, whenever you examine cases of polygamy, there's always a problem. And by implication, the scriptures teach that monogamy is what God intended. God did not create 2 women for Adam. In the New Testament, pastors are to be the husband of 1 wife to set an example for the rest of the congregation. Now, it's interesting, you have this interesting tension in the Bible. The Bible never depicts a second or third wife as not a real wife. On the same hand, it never, ever, ever encourages polygamy. And here's a good example of it. Because of a polygamous relationship, and because one wife has children and the other doesn't, but the husband does have children, he's really unable to give the support to his wife that he ought to be able to give to her. If he were in the same boat as she was, he'd get it a lot better. But he's not. So there's a lesson to be learned, but the writer doesn't come out and say to you, by the way, this is why you shouldn't have more than one wife.
In other words, it's monogamy or hell.
Or both. You know, it depends if you're married the wrong person. Okay. But simply stated, the writer is kind of telling you, without beating you over the head with it, monogamy is what God intended. Okay, and we don't have time to do it, but we could look at other examples in the Bible, and there's always, always, always a problem when somebody has more than one wife, due to the fact simply that they have more than one wife. Okay, so this kind of subtle way of saying to you, probably not a good idea to practice anything other than monogamy. Things like polygamy don't work. He just shows you how it doesn't work. And you need to pay attention or you miss it. Now, one of the things that we're going to find out when we go through the book of Samuel is he often doesn't tell us why he's relating what he's relating. He's expecting us to figure it out as we read it. It's very rare that the author comes out and says, and by the way, this is why.
Pay attention here.
It's just pay attention. Let the reader be aware. Okay, this is a good example of how he works. Okay, so he shows this problem. You know, it's hard, obviously, for a childless couple that desire to have children. It's even harder when the husband can't support his wife when she wants to have children, because he has children. In some sense, he doesn't know what she's going through. Okay, so it's very subtle here. He doesn't beat you over the head with it, like I said, but he is teaching us something about what God intended by showing us when you do what God didn't intend, what can happen. Okay, of course God has plans here. So let's go on, because the chapter doesn't end in verse 8. And let's read the next few verses. Oops, I keep on going the wrong way here. So this is a little bit bigger section, but could somebody read verses 9 through 18?
Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were not moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast.
Okay, so fairly well-known story. I remember learning it when I was a child in Sunday school, of Hannah praying. Well, what happens here is very interesting. First of all, when we first meet Eli, and the last time we meet Eli, he's sitting on a chair. So, right here, Eli's sitting on a chair. The last time we'll meet Eli in the book, he'll be sitting on a chair. Bookends. The author, again, why does he include the detail, Eli's sitting on a chair? It's to make these bookends. Okay? The tabernacle here, interestingly, is called temple. And in fact, it's only called the tabernacle one time, 2 Samuel 7:16. Oh, I'm sorry, 3 times. 2 Samuel 7:16, 3:3, and 2 Samuel 23:7. Everywhere else, it's called the temple. Now you say, well, what's with that? Because I thought Solomon built the temple, right? Well, as far as God's concerned, this is his temple. The stone and wood structure that Solomon built doesn't change God's status in any way. Okay, God allows a permanent temple to be built. David wants to build it. As we find out in 2 Samuel, Solomon ends up building it. But God is just his home in the tent. Okay, that's his temple. Okay, it's just a portable temple. Okay, and so that's what the writer usually calls it. Because he's saying to us, yeah, later on David's going to want to build a temple, but don't think that that makes God more important just because he has a permanent structure. Okay, this is just as important. He's just as important living in this. So again, subtle little thing. You can't change God's status by what you build. Okay. Also here, we find Hannah's promise, right? She prays and she makes this promise. This child will be the Lord's his entire life. Now, Levites usually served 25 years, from the ages of 25 to 50. So, usually you couldn't start service to God until you got to be 25. And you went into retirement from service to God. You might still work your farm or something. At 50. Okay, so they have this 25-year spread. But she's promising that he will be God's servant his entire life. And we find Samuel is already as a young boy is going to be serving God in the tabernacle. And we're going to find Samuel all the way to his end of his life. He's going to be serving God as a prophet. Okay, so long after his 50th birthday has passed. Okay, so that's her promise. She's saying he will serve God exceeding the time that the Levites normally serve God. Okay, and a razor will never be used on his head, which is probably a reference to what is called the Nazarite vow. This has nothing to do with Nazareth, where Jesus was from. Nazarites were people who could dedicate themselves to God in a special way. And there's a law in, I'll give you the reference there, right? Numbers chapter 6 that defines how you do this. One of the things about Nazarites were they were to not cut their hair as long as they were under their Nazarite vow. Now, normally you can take a Nazarite vow for a week, month, year, whatever time you determine. But whatever that is, that you took this vow to set yourself aside for God during that period of time, you didn't cut your hair. You cut it at the end when the period was over. Well, she apparently is dedicating her son as a Nazarite from birth. The other thing Nazarites weren't doing, she doesn't mention this here, Nazarites were not to have any grape products. So they couldn't have grape, they couldn't have grape juice, couldn't have wine. Okay. That's not mentioned here, but perhaps implied. Okay. We don't know too many people in the Bible by name who were Nazarites. We know some did exist. Sometimes the Bible mentions Nazarites without mentioning names. But apparently, Samson, remember the hair, and Samuel were Nazarites. Samson, we know for sure, the angel commands his mother when she's pregnant with him, he'll be a Nazarite from birth. Okay, so he's specifically called a Nazarite. Samuel's not called a Nazarite, but from this vow that Hannah takes, it sounds like that's what she's doing. She's dedicating him to the Lord for permanent service and to be this Nazarite, this person set aside for God. So that's what's going on. Now Eli's blessing, he's the high priest. This is a promise from God. Go in peace. As I tell you, it's a phrase used several times in the book of Samuel to signal that the speaker holds no ill will against the hearer. Right at first he says, what are you doing? You're drunk, right? And she says, no, you got it wrong. I'm not drunk. I'm distressed, right? When he says go in peace, he's saying, I hold no ill will towards you. I accept your explanation. And in essence, he's wishing her God's blessing that her prayer will be answered. So that phrase, go in peace, is important. And we see it a number of times, 3 times I have there in the book of Samuel, but also elsewhere in the Bible. So when they say go in peace, they mean, I'm not at odds with you, I don't have anything against you, we're good. Okay. That's what he's telling. How are we doing for time? We're just about out of time. So, well, we've done a chunk of 1 Samuel 1. And I think this may be a good place to stop. We'll find out about Samuel's birth then when we come back next week. And what happens subsequently, we have a very beautiful prayer by Hannah in chapter 2. And next week, hopefully, we'll have some time to look at Hannah's prayer as she thanks God for answering